The purpose of this webinar today is to talk about hurricane prep and trees. This is a topic that we come across every single year as soon as hurricane season starts. It's really important to have your trees ready for hurricanes. And we're going to talk about 4 steps that we designed to help you prepare your trees for a hurricane and what to do after a hurricane as well. So hopefully if you follow these 4 steps, we'll be able to reduce any damage to property, tree health, and hopefully no damage to human life. It's always most important. So we're going to start with our PowerPoint I have over here. And before we actually get into those 4 steps, I wanted to talk about why it's actually so important to talk about trees and hurricanes. So the first thing we'll start with is when hurricane season actually is. So it technically starts June 1st, but the number of hurricanes are pretty rare. It's pretty low that early in the season. It really doesn't pick up until early August. Now this graph shows the number of hurricanes over the last 100 years, and it's a pretty consistent trend. It really peaks late August and early September, and then it starts to dwindle into October, and very rare to get one into November, December. And the peak, according to NOAA, is September 10th. So we're coming up on that date pretty quickly. We've been very fortunate so far to really not have much hurricane activity, but that doesn't mean we're not going to see more, and it could still happen all the way into December. So it's nice to see this graph to remind us that it can start really early and it can go very late. So while it's more common in early September, it can really happen anytime in that range. And that can be any intensity as well. So speaking of the intensity of hurricanes, over the last 40 years, the number of hurricanes per year hasn't really changed much on average. There have been, above average years, below average, but the intensity of hurricanes has increased. So if you look at this figure, category 1, 2, and 3 hurricanes have decreased over time. Sorry about my cat. But category 4 and 5 hurricanes have steadily risen over time. So this is one of those things that we talk about with climate change. It's not necessarily the frequency of hurricanes that may increase, but the intensity is increasing over time. And we have to think about that as we manage our trees in urban areas, our urban forests, and how do we actually prepare our forests for these more intense hurricanes. It's not just these low-level strong winds. We have really devastating storms that are happening more and more often. So what are the effects of these different levels of storms? It's easy to say, oh, well, a category 4 is coming, but what does that actually mean in terms of trees and damage and tree risk? So this figure here is really for a direct impact of a hurricane. So that doesn't happen very often in Savannah. We're very fortunate to not receive a direct hit of a hurricane too frequently. But when that does happen, here are the things that you can expect. So a category 1, you might see some branch and some tree failures. Usually those are your most unhealthy or degraded trees. Category 2, you're going to start to see some major tree failures. So large limbs falling off the tree, maybe some actual trees toppling down. Category 3 is really where it starts to pick up. So you start to see more large tree failures, and this is really where it gets into that zone of healthy trees can start to fail here. The winds are so strong, it'll just pull the leaves right off the tree. Category 4, again, picks up even more, massive tree blowdowns. You can have perfectly healthy trees that come down into category 4. And in a category 5, a direct hit, you're going to see the majority of the trees fail in these strong winds. I mean, those winds are upwards of 155 miles per hour sustained. And that's just an incredible amount of stress to be putting on a tree, which again is a living organism. They can only tolerate so much environmental stress. So it's important to sort of gauge what the differences are. Now, these shift depending on how close by the hurricane actually hits. So as I mentioned, Savannah is not frequently hit directly by a hurricane. So if a category 4 is passing near us, maybe we'll experience effects of a category 3 directly. So it really can vary a lot. It also can vary incredibly by tree species. There's a reason that live oaks are planted so predominantly here on the coast. They are incredibly strong trees, very dense wood, very low center of gravity, very wide. So it really can vary quite a bit depending on the tree species in the state of a hurricane. And the health of the tree makes it a very large difference as well. We're going to talk about that in just a minute. So this is what I mean when I say a blowdown. So this tree was apparently otherwise healthy, and this was during Hurricane Matthew. And all these pictures I'm about to show are post-Hurricane Matthew, which was a Category 5 storm that hit very close to here. So maybe not exactly here in Savannah, but essentially we received the full effect of Category 5. Now you can see all the roots are still intact around the base of this tree. And that portion that's lifted is called the root plate. So tree roots can extend very far out of a tree, but there's a section near the base of the tree called the root plate where it's most dense, strongest roots, and it essentially takes that entire plate with it when it topples over. So this tree was healthy. It just received so much wind and so much force on the tree that it toppled over and took its root plate with it. This is a common occurrence in hurricanes, especially with shorter trees like this. And we'll talk about pine trees are kind of in a weird range. Well, actually, we'll talk about pine trees right now. So this is a great diagram. Don't worry about all of this. We won't get too in-depth here. But essentially, this just emphasizes the forces that are happening on a tree during a hurricane. So we have our tree crown at the top, all that green space. It's got the trunk, the stem, that root plate. Remember, it's just that kind of dense section of roots around the base of the tree. And then even further out, you have your transport and absorbing roots. So that root system really does extend very far from the trunk of the tree. Now, that wind is putting a lateral force on the tree that it doesn't normally experience much of. And so what can happen, especially when the soils are really wet, we got a lot of flooding during a hurricane, is that tree will just rotate on its center of gravity. So it'll take the root plate with it, and that tree crown will come down onto the ground. And you can see here that red circle sort of illustrates how the tree rotates when it loses all of that friction, that tension in the soil. Now, saturated, wet soils are much harder to grab onto than a dry soil. So tree roots are pretty good at latching onto soil and staying upright. That all changes when soil is saturated. Now, saturated is different than just being wet. We like moist soils, that's good. Water is great for trees. But saturated means the soil can no longer hold all the water it's being given, and so you get flooding. And that's when it really starts to lose that strength, and it can be really susceptible to wind. So it's not just wind, it's not just flooding. The combination of the two can really be disastrous when it comes to trees coming down. Now, I did mention pine trees. Pines sort of change this diagram. So the tree crown of a pine is almost always at the very top. And essentially what happens is you have a lot of strain on the very top of the tree from that wind. And even if you have dry soils, that top can break off if it's experienced extreme wind. The Category 5, 160-mile-an-hour winds, it's putting so much strain on the top of that tree. And that's why we don't like to see pine trees planted individually. So in a forest, trees can sort of share that wind load. They're not experiencing it by themselves. And pine failure is a lot less likely when it's surrounded by other pine trees. But when you see a pine on its own, all of that crown is at the very top of the tree. It makes that failure more likely, especially under these extreme wind loads. So that's why you tend to see pines with the top snapped off rather than the whole thing tipped over. So it has to do with that crown and the wind load on that crown. So this is a great diagram, and these diagrams and figures that I'm presenting are from Dr. Kim Coder with the University of Georgia. Incredibly knowledgeable professor. He is the live oak wizard, so I encourage you to look up any of his publications. They are all absolutely incredible to read, very fascinating, and wonderful information. So that's with a healthy tree. We're going to talk about trees that maybe aren't so healthy. Now, if we go back to that last figure, remember this has the root plate, it's lifting all of its roots with it. This is a healthy tree that failed under extreme wind from Matthew. This tree doesn't have a root plate here, if you notice. There's not a lot of roots attached to it. So it appears that there was some sort of decay, some weakening of the base of this tree. And this is really what we're going to try to focus on today, are trees that have indications of decay or weakness, things that we can address to prevent this sort of failure. Now this is an incredibly large live oak tree, downtown Savannah. All trees are susceptible to hurricane failure. There's really no, hurricane-proof tree. Live oaks are hurricane resistant for sure, but there's no such thing that's hurricane-proof. So this is one of those things that we're going to address and look out for today, so we can hopefully avoid failures like this. Again, we have a couple more examples of tree failure here. On the left, you can see a major branch was lost from that tree, and I think hopefully you can see my mouse here. There is a large section of dark portion here that's decay inside this tree. And so that was likely the point of failure, where that branch came off the tree. And again, here, this tree on the right, lots of decay. There were almost no roots that were lifted here. So this was a very weak tree at the base. And sometimes it's hard to find. It's hard to identify that. It can show no outward symptoms. So there's no guarantee you're going to be able to detect this all the time. But there are some things you can do to identify that. And we'll talk about branch unions here in just a minute. We won't get to that yet. So let's get into what you can actually do to try to prevent these sorts of failures, because we really don't want to see this happen. We want to do everything we can to try to prevent this. And again, no tree is hurricane proof. Even if your tree is perfectly healthy, there's still a chance that it could come down in extreme hurricane winds. So we're going to do everything we can to prevent that, though. So let's go to the Savannah Tree Foundation website. So if you go to savannahtreefoundation.com, that will take you to our new website. This is actually a placeholder. We're working on a new and improved website that hopefully will be out in the next couple months. But we still have some great resources on here in the meantime. So if you go over to the More button over here, there's a little drop down that says Hurricane Prep. So that's what we're going to talk about. We're going to go to that page today. Now, if you recall at the beginning, there are 4 steps that we highlighted. So we're going to walk through this guide together, and I'm going to explain how to use it and why each of these steps are so important. So the first step that we have to work through is identify. So we have to identify if this tree has some risk, if it's worth looking at, or if you think it's healthy and it's fine, leave it alone, that's okay. And really, this guide can be used any time of year. It's most important to try to prepare your trees for hurricane season, but you can use this at any time of year. So we really encourage you to always take a look at your trees. So we'll go down to here, identify, and we've got a little arrow right here that we'll click on that takes us to the first step. So we're going to identify any potential signs of risk on your trees. Now, we're going to talk about some of the main ones here. There are lots and lots of them. If you are concerned at all outside of this, if you're really not sure, we're going to talk about what you can do. But this is really just to get you started. These are some of the most common, most obvious signs to look for. So the first is, where's the tree located? That is always the most important step when addressing risk. So is it near a building, a high traffic area? Is it along Drayton Street? Is it hanging over your house? Those trees have risk, even if it's completely healthy. There's always a chance of failure. It's a living organism. So paying attention to where the tree is actually growing is the first important step to addressing risk with trees. Now, on the flip side, we may have a tree in the middle of a forest, out in the middle of nowhere, no walking trails, no roads, nothing around it. The risk is really low there, almost non-existent. It'd be very rare for someone to be out there in the middle of a hurricane, at least I hope they wouldn't be. So that is kind of the flip side. You know, we have to consider that a tree that's in the middle of nowhere, even if it's very unhealthy, there's no one around it. There's really not any risk. So that's the first step. Where is the tree located? The next step is, are there any large dead branches? So this is a really common point of failure during high winds. Dead branches and dead limbs are very brittle wood. That wood breaks a lot easier under wind as compared to a healthy branch. So that's going to be one of the earliest points of failure under those high winds. And that's something we can look for. It's really easy to spot. You know, we're in the middle of summer. Pretty much every tree is leafed out right now, or it should be. So if it's not, that's a good indicator that you should take a look at it. So it's really easy to spot some branches that maybe don't have limbs, or excuse me, don't have leaves, are looking really poor. Maybe that limb is really yellowed compared to the rest of the tree. So that's another thing that's important to look for. And small branches, you know, something this big, really not a concern. But if you've got some large branches about, you know, this big, that have no leaves on them that look dead, that's a cause for concern. So that's something to keep an eye out for. Now, the next thing we're going to look at is the lean of the tree. Now, again, none of these factors are guaranteed to make a tree hazardous. These are just things to identify to address risk. But lean is one that can indicate some hazard, some risk for the tree, and sometimes not. Sometimes trees just have a natural lean to them. Our live oaks can be very curvy and leaning and have some lean and still be perfectly healthy, especially because they have such strong wood. You know, live oaks have very dense, strong wood, so a little bit of lean there is not an issue. But this is something to keep an eye out for. It is a part of addressing risk. Now, one thing that I do want to mention with lean, we talked about that root plate. So we'll go back and look at what I mean when I say root plate. That section there. Now, if you see a tree that's leaning and part of that ground behind it is starting to lift, so right here, if that ground is lifted, that's indicating that that root plate is starting to lift as well. That's a sign of risk. So that is something to look for, and one of those things to sort of check off on your list and say, okay, well, that's maybe not a great thing. And then the last one, pardon my cat, she's very chirpy. The last one we want to look at is, do the tree branches meet in a V instead of a U? So I'm going to go back to this figure I have here at the end. And this is what I mean when I see a U versus a V. So on the left, you can see two branches coming off of one union, and they make a nice sort of rounded U shape. And that's really what we're looking for. We want a nice, spacious, healthy branch union there. On the right, we have a V-shaped union. Now, these unions are weak primarily because those two branches are growing wider and trying to get bigger and more structurally sound, but they're running into each other. So you'll get in this middle section here what's called included bark. And this can be a source of decay, disease, and structurally weak wood. So it's not guaranteed to be a hazard, but it can be a point of failure. And this is just another one of those factors to look for when you're assessing risk. Now, you might say, well, I'm not an arborist. What do I do when I've identified some of these things? I don't know how to prune a tree. Well, let's go to the next step. So the next one is inspect. So after identifying your potentially risky trees, if you've seen some of these factors or anything else that you think might be risky, we need to have it inspected. But is it actually your tree? That's a common question we get here, especially in Savannah. There are a lot of places that might be kind of confusing whether or not it's your tree or the city's tree. And we want to make sure that we're being responsible. And many municipalities have rules against pruning city trees. So we want to make sure that we're not breaking any of those rules. So the first step is to make sure if it's publicly or privately owned. So there are a couple good rules of thumb. You know, large medians are typically publicly owned. A good example here in Savannah downtown are Liberty and Oglethorpe. very large medians, those are maintained by the city. Another great example here are the tree lawns. So that is a section of green space between a sidewalk and a curb. Those trees are city owned. So you don't want to prune them, even if it's right in front of your house. If they're in a tree lawn, those are city owned trees. So we got to make sure, there's a couple easy rules of thumb like those. But if you're really not sure, we have a great resource on this website. So if you mouse over this image here and click on it, hopefully it loads. This will take you to the Savannah Area Geographic Information System. This website is absolutely incredible. It is a fantastic resource. It was created by the Metropolitan Planning Commission here in Savannah, well, in Chatham County. And if we go over here to this link, it's called the SAGES Map Viewer. This is a really fantastic resource that will help you determine where your property line is, in addition to some other fun factors I'm going to point out, because it really is just a wonderful resource in general. So let's take a look at the Savannah Tree Foundation office. So we are at 502 Fair Street. If we click on this, it'll actually zoom right into our address, and it has all of our property lines on the map already. Now, it can be a little difficult to tell, it's just showing the roads and the property lines right here. So what we want to do is we want to actually see, well, what does the satellite imagery look like? I want to know where that line is. So if you go down here to the bottom, and the fourth button from the left says Base Map Gallery. So we'll click on that, and it gives us all these options for the base map. So we want to look at satellite imagery. You can pick any year that you want, really, but let's do the most recent. So we're going to look at March 2020. So we'll click on that, and voila, we get to see exactly what the satellite imagery looks like, and we can zoom in and see exactly where these property lines are. And that can be really helpful. If you own a piece of property and you're not sure where that line is, this can help you. And some of those trees on the very edge may actually be city managed trees. So this is a really great way to help you determine where you have responsibility and where your municipality has responsibility. Really fantastic resource here. While I'm here, let's go back to our map. Let's see, I think we just want the normal street map. There we go. So let's close these, and we're going to zoom out just a little bit. And while we're on the topic of hurricanes, I really wanted to stress how great of a resource SAGES is. So if we go to the layer list, this is the second button over here, we can look at some really incredible things that will help us in terms of hurricane preparedness. One of the most important ones to know prior to a hurricane are the hurricane evacuation zones and the hurricane evacuation routes. All you have to do is click these two buttons here on the layer list, and they appear. If you click this arrow to the left, it tells you the names for the color coding. So you can figure out if you're in zone A, B, or C based on this map. This is incredibly useful. Please utilize this resource. You don't want to be preparing to evacuate and not sure where you are, very uncertain. SEMA does a very fantastic job of telling you what the boundaries are, but if you know ahead of time, that just makes you all the more prepared. So this is a really fantastic resource here. So I encourage you to utilize this not only to find your property lines, but to prepare for hurricanes and also utilize some of these really fantastic resources that SAGES has. So you've determined if it's on public property or private property. What do you do now? Well, if we go to the next step here, if it's publicly owned, contact your municipality to request an inspection. So again, many municipalities have tree ordinances where they have rules against working or pruning on city-owned trees. So it's really important that you don't just go out there and start doing work on it. We want to make sure that they can do the inspection. So Many municipalities will be able to do that on pretty short notice, especially if you think it is a hazardous or risky tree. Now, if it's privately owned, if it's on your property, we always recommend getting a consultation from a certified arborist. Not just a tree care company. We want to make sure it's someone who is certified and a professional in their field. So, how do you know how to find an arborist? Well, we did that for you too. So if you click on this image here, this will take you to another page on our website where we have listed local Savannah area arborists that have, tree care companies that have arborists on staff as of 2020. So an arborist is someone who has passed an examination on best practices and will take care of a tree in a way that's best for you, the tree, and your property. Thanks, Nick. Appreciate it. So we really want to make sure that we're having professionals assess your trees, especially during hurricane season. Sometimes there are folks who go out there and try to take advantage of the chaos and just make a quick buck and may not do very good work on your tree, may actually make it more hazardous. So we want to make sure that you're using an arborist, someone that is a professional in the field. So we'll come back to this list again in a minute, but this covers the Savannah area and the Hilton Head area. And again, available on our website. Okay, so we're going to have someone inspect our tree, but what are they going to do? Well, they might prune the tree. This is one of the most common preventative measures that you can do to help your trees before a hurricane. And we actually compiled a walkthrough video with ISA certified arborist Shem Kendrick. He's the local co-owner of Coastal Arbor Care. He's also on the board of the Savannah Tree Foundation. And if you watch this video, he walks through how he assesses the tree, what sort of prescriptions he would suggest. And it's a really fantastic process. It's really great to see how it works. Now this video is about 15 minutes long, so we won't watch it here together, but this is on our website. If you just click this link here, it is also on our YouTube channel, and I believe it's on our Facebook as well. So a lot of ways to find it, and I highly suggest watching it. Oh, Nick has a great question. He says, I have a tough question. What about a troubled/dead tree on private property in the backyard that is hanging over another person's yard and they're worried about damage, asking for a friend? Well, that can get a little tricky when you're looking at trees that are on two different properties. So if a tree exists, if the trunk is solely on your property, but you have a branch hanging over on the other property, it's typically the landowner's responsibility where the tree is based. Now that can vary based on municipality. So I would first and foremost check with an arborist because they know the rules of the municipalities that they work in. So it really can vary from place to place. The best thing you can do is try to communicate with your neighbors. And if it's something that's mutually beneficial for you to do, maybe you can share the cost of an arborist. That is typically what I suggest. And let's see. Yeah, it's usually, communication is probably the best thing that you can do is try to communicate as best you can and have an arborist take a look at it. Because again, sometimes those municipality rules can be a little tricky to deal with. Having an arborist assess it will definitely be the best way to move forward with that.
Jake, can I weigh in here?
Yeah, absolutely. Go ahead, Zoe.
So this is Zoe Ranker. I'm the executive director of STF. I just want to say that if once a branch crosses into your yard, you are able to prune it without permission of the next door neighbor. So if it's a specific branch that's overhanging your roof, you can cut it to the property line. But if it's a bigger issue with the tree, then you need to start talking about, again, communication is key, but you need to start kind of figuring out a longer term plan. And if the trunk is on the other person's property, they obviously need to be a part of that solution.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Zoe. I appreciate that. All right. So third step was pruning. This is one of the best steps that you can do to prevent failure for your trees during a hurricane. Thanks, Nick. So let's move on. So these 3 steps are before a hurricane. So there's a lot we can do to try to prevent damage to trees and to property before a hurricane. But what happens after a hurricane? Like I said, sometimes there's only so much you can do. Even a perfectly healthy tree can fail during a storm, especially extreme ones like a Category 5. So protect. The most important thing to do is to protect yourself and those around you. It can be chaotic and scary if a tree comes down. The most important thing is to take care of yourself, take care of those around you. So first step, if someone has been hurt, please call 911. That is obviously the most important thing that you can do. We love trees, but we got to take care of ourselves before we can take care of the trees. The next thing is looking for utility lines that may have been damaged. You know, if it's an electric line, call Georgia Power or your utility provider. Any other utilities like water or gas lines, please contact your municipality. Those can also be very dangerous. But the most important thing is to just not touch the tree. I know sometimes it can be tempting, like, oh, you want to try to, you know, prevent more damage if it's laying on your roof, but it is so important not to touch the tree for a lot of reasons. These ones to start, but also trees can have a lot of strain and pressure on them once they've fallen down. And if you begin cutting that tree or moving it, it can react unpredictably. A great example that I have seen before, we'll go back to this picture right here, is I have seen folks who begin cutting a tree like this at the top of the tree, so, you know, near the very top, and as they're removing weight, that tree will actually sit back up because it has that counterweight of the root plate and all that soil that flings it back up into the air. That can be incredibly dangerous. If you have a leg over the trunk, if you're standing on top of the tree cutting, it can be so, so dangerous, and that has so much force when it flings back up. So very important not to touch a down tree. Now, after you've checked for, you know, that everyone is okay, no one's been hurt, checking for utilities, any downed electrical lines, again, we have to make sure where this tree actually is. If it's on public property, call 311 or your municipality. They will be able to come out and assess the tree. Now, this is important for a couple reasons. The first being that it's not your responsibility, so you don't have to pay for it. You don't have to endanger your safety. They will take care of it. The next is some municipalities can actually get assistance from FEMA post-disaster, but they have to be able to assess the tree and what the damage was. So if you cut the tree up and stack it up nicely, they don't actually know what the extent of the damage was. So they may not be able to receive funding to help with that. So if you just leave it alone, call the municipality, that is the best thing that you can do. Now, if it's on your property, there's a couple steps you could do. Again, please don't handle it yourself. If you're a renter, please call your landlord. Call your insurance provider. That is always so important to assess damage before you start doing anything, potentially causing more damage. And then again, call a certified arborist. They are experts in their field. They will know how to remove a tree safely without causing further damage or harm. And again, if you click on this image here, this will take you to our local arborist page. So we have a nice compiled list here. We always recommend getting multiple consultations if possible. Sometimes arborists can book out, so it's good to explore the options, but this is a fantastic list to utilize. And I really do want to stress this again, post-hurricane especially. Sometimes you'll see a lot of folks come in from out of town. They may not have good certifications. They may just be someone with a chainsaw offering their services. We really don't recommend going with those folks. Even if it takes a little bit longer, it's so much safer to have an arborist remove that tree because they know what they're doing. They know how to do it safely. That's the name of the game throughout this whole process. We want to do all of this safely. It's about your safety, the safety of your property, and those around you. So this is our 4-step hurricane prep guide. And we'll just wrap back around here again. So if you just go to savannahtreefoundation.com, this is where we have all of our resources. There are links throughout all these pages. And again, I mentioned this at the beginning, we are posting this video on our YouTube and Facebook. So this recording is available later. If you're not sure how to use the guide, please watch this video. We'll help walk you through it. And I think that is where we will leave it off. If there are any questions, I'm happy to answer them. And actually, I don't think I have my contact information on the screen, but if you do have questions, you can contact us on our website. Please send us a message. We are always happy to answer any tree related questions. If we don't know it, we can point you to someone who does. And we have our phone number and email down here as well if you don't want to use the contact form. So thank you all so much for watching. I'll leave it open for a couple minutes for questions if we have any other additional questions. Oh, did want to add this quick note. So I like to press plant leaves. It's a fun hobby of mine. And here in the corner, I've got a calorie pear, also known as the Bradford pear, which is quite a nuisance of a tree species. And that is one of those trees that is subject to those V's. It grows branches really close together. And so you'll often find a lot of dead branches in calorie pears because of that reason. So that is why we mentioned identifying one of those risk factors and how they can vary so much depending on the tree species. More common in a calorie pear, so I wanted to have that example for today because that's one to keep an eye out for. All right, so I think we will wrap up here. And again, I will just end on this screen right here: identify, inspect, prune, and protect. Just great 4-step process. I really encourage everybody to try to walk through that process and ensure the health of your trees for your safety and your property safety prior to hurricane season.